The blood wouldn't stop. Thalia pressed her trembling hands against her swollen belly, feeling the warm wetness seeping through the thin fabric of her ruined dress. Each step sent lightning bolts of agony through her abdomen, and she could taste copper on her tongue, where she'd bitten through her lip to keep from screaming. The forest floor tilted beneath her bare feet. They'd taken her shoes, of course, along with everything else. And she caught herself against a birch tree, bark scraping her palms raw. Keep moving, or die here. Her wolf, usually a constant presence prowling beneath her skin, had gone terrifyingly silent. Ever since Zephyr had pronounced her fate before the pack 3 days ago, that inner voice had retreated somewhere deep and dark, leaving Thalia hollow in a way she'd never experienced. She'd always been able to feel her wolf, even in her weakest moments. Now there was just nothing, an echoing emptiness where her other half should be. The trees thinned ahead, and she could see it through her blurring vision, the great stone wall that marked the border of the Shadow Kingdom. Massive blocks of obsidian dark granite rose 30 feet into the gray morning sky, topped with iron spikes that gleamed wetly in the mist. The gate itself was forged from what looked like black iron, worked into intricate patterns of snarling wolves and crescent moons. Tribute, she thought, the word tasting like ash. I'm tribute. She won't make it to the gate. Someone had laughed when they'd thrown her out of the cart a mile back. One of Zephyr's enforcers, the one with the scarred lip who'd always looked at her with hungry eyes. Bleeding like a stuck pig. The Shadow King will think we sent him a corpse. That's the point. Her brother's voice, cold as the winter wind cutting through her thin dress. Damaged goods, an insult wrapped in obligation. Let Shadowfang deal with the mess. She'd crawled the first 100 yards before finding the strength to stand. Pride, maybe. Or spite. Or simply the desperate need to prove them wrong about one thing, just one thing, before she died. The baby kicked. Thalia gasped, her hands flying to the swell of her belly where she felt that precious flutter of movement. Still alive. After everything. After the 3 days without food. After the beatings when she'd begged for a healer. After the mile-long stumble through hostile territory. Her baby was still fighting. Then so am I. She pushed off from the tree and forced her legs to carry her forward. 20 more steps to the wall. 15. 10. The world grayed at the edges, and she could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. Too fast. Too weak. Blood ran down her inner thighs now, soaking into the mud with each lurching step. The gates loomed before her, impossibly tall, impossibly far. Thalia collapsed. Her knees hit the frozen ground first, then her palms, then her shoulder as she crumpled sideways against the base of the wall. The stone was ice cold against her fevered cheek, and she thought distantly that this wasn't such a terrible place to die. At least she'd made it out of Duskwalker territory. At least she'd denied Zephyr the satisfaction of watching her take her last breath. I'm sorry, she thought to the life flickering inside her. I tried. I tried so hard. The sound of the gate grinding open barely registered. Voices, sharp, commanding, seemed to come from very far away. Someone's collapsed at the gate. Is it an attack? A distraction? No, look. It's a woman. She's bleeding everywhere. Boots on stone, coming closer. Thalia tried to lift her head to see who would witness her end, but her body had finally surrendered. All she could do was lie there, broken and bleeding, as shadows fell across her face. Rough hands gripped her shoulders, turning her onto her back. She expected cruelty. Expected the same callous handling she'd received from her own pack, the same dismissive disgust. What she got instead was a sharp intake of breath, a muttered curse, and then warmth. It started where those hands touched her, spreading through her failing body like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Thalia's eyes flew open, and she found herself staring up at a face that made her breath catch in her throat. He wasn't handsome in the classical sense. His features were too harsh for that. All sharp angles and hard lines. A scar bisected his left eyebrow, and several days' worth of dark stubble shadowed his jaw. But his eyes. His eyes were the deep amber of autumn honey, and they were staring at her with an intensity that made her skin prickle with awareness. He wore common soldier's clothing, mud-stained leather armor, a worn sword belt, boots that had seen better days. But the way he held himself, the way the other soldiers had fallen back the moment he'd stepped forward, this was no ordinary man. "Get the healers," he said, and his voice was low and rough, scraping over her nerve endings like velvet over stone. "Now." "Sir, she's just tribute. The Duskwalker Pack's offering to settle the border dispute. We're not required to—" The man's head snapped toward the speaker, and even in her fading state, Thalia saw the flash of gold that overtook his amber eyes. "Did I stutter?" The soldier ran. Thalia tried to speak, to ask what was happening, but only a weak moan escaped her cracked lips. The man looked back down at her, and something in his expression shifted, hardness giving way to something that looked almost like wonder. "You're safe now," he said, gathering her into his arms as if she weighed nothing. "I've got you." His scent hit her then, and everything inside her went still and silent. Pine and wood smoke and something darker, muskier. The scent of a powerful male in his prime. It wrapped around her like a physical thing, sinking into her pores, her lungs, her very bones. And deep in that hollow place where her wolf had retreated, something stirred. No, Thalia thought desperately, even as heat bloomed in her chest. No, this can't be. Her wolf surged forward with a force that made her gasp, pressing against her skin, howling a single word that shattered every defense she'd built. Mate. The man went rigid. His arms tightened around her, pulling her closer against his chest, and she heard a growl rumble through him, low, possessive, primal. His nostrils flared as he scented her, and when their eyes met again, his had gone fully gold, blazing like twin suns. "Mine," he breathed, so soft only she could hear. Thalia's heart, traitor that it was, answered with a surge of impossible warmth. The mate bond. She'd heard of it, dreamed of it as a girl, before she'd learned that dreams were just another thing that could be taken away. The instant recognition, the pull that transcended choice or reason or will. But this had to be wrong, had to be a trick. She was broken and bleeding, carrying another male's child, sold as tribute to a kingdom that could just as easily execute her as accept her. The universe wasn't kind enough to give her this. "It's real," her wolf insisted, pressing against her skin with desperate urgency. "He's ours. Finally. Finally ours." "You need to put me down," Thalia managed, her voice a ragged whisper. "I'm tribute. I'm nothing. You don't want—" "I want." His jaw clenched so hard she could see the muscle jumping beneath the stubble. "Whatever you were before, whoever sent you, none of that matters now. You're mine. You don't understand." Tears she couldn't afford to cry were streaming down her temples, leaving hot tracks on her chilled skin. "My brother sold me. My pack threw me away. I'm carrying someone else's child, and I'm dying, and I'm—" "The child is innocent." His hand, impossibly gentle despite its size and calluses, brushed the matted hair from her face. "And you're not dying. Not today. Not ever, if I have anything to say about it." "You're just a soldier," she whispered, but her wolf was pressing forward again, straining toward him with every fiber of her being. "What can you possibly—" "Ash!" One of the other soldiers was running back, 3 robed figures following close behind. "The healers are here." The man, Ash, didn't look away from her face. "Good. Take us to the western wing. The best rooms. And send word to the castle. No one enters or leaves until I give the order. The castle? But sir, you can't possibly— Did that sound like a request? The soldiers scattered like startled birds. Thalia's vision was graying again, the brief surge of adrenaline fading as blood loss caught up with her. But even as consciousness slipped away, she felt his arms tighten around her, felt the rumble of his voice against her cheek as he started walking. "Stay with me," he commanded, and there was alpha authority in those words, the kind that demanded obedience. "You're not allowed to leave me before I've even learned your name." "Thalia," she wanted to say. "My name is Thalia, and I've been fighting so hard to survive, and I'm so tired. And please, please, let this be real." But darkness was pulling her under, and the last thing she felt was his heartbeat against her ear, steady and strong and somehow, impossibly, beating in rhythm with her own. The first thing Thalia became aware of was warmth, not the feverish heat of infection or the burning pain of her injuries, but a gentle, encompassing warmth that seemed to sink into her bones. She was lying on something soft, softer than anything she'd touched in months, and the scent of clean linens and healing herbs surrounded her. She didn't open her eyes immediately. She'd learned caution in Zephyr's pack, learned that showing weakness could be fatal. So she lay still, keeping her breathing even, and listened. Voices speaking low nearby. Hemorrhaging has stopped, but she lost a dangerous amount of blood. Another hour, and we couldn't have saved either of them. The baby? That voice she knew. Ash. Something in her chest clenched at the sound of it. Strong heartbeat. Remarkable, really, given what she's been through. The child is a fighter, like its mother. A long exhale. And her other injuries? A pause. Then carefully. She's been beaten. Repeatedly, and recently. There's bruising on her ribs, her arms, her back. Some of it is days old, some of it is fresh. She hasn't been fed properly. Malnutrition combined with pregnancy put enormous strain on her body. And the bleeding— Another pause. It was induced. Someone gave her wolfsbane. Not enough to kill her outright, but enough to trigger a miscarriage. Silence. Then, very quietly, "Who?" "I can't say for certain. But given the timing and the dosage, it had to be someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Someone who wanted her to suffer, but wanted it to look natural." Thalia's hands had curled into fists beneath the blanket. Zephyr. Of course it was Zephyr. She remembered now. The tea he'd insisted she drink before they loaded her into the cart. "For the journey," he'd said, wearing that thin, cold smile he'd perfected since becoming Alpha. "To keep your strength up." She'd known better than to refuse. "I want to know everything about the Duskwalker pack." Ash's voice had gone hard as stone. Their alpha, their alliances, their weaknesses. Everything. With respect. That's a matter for the King's Council. Then tell the King's Council to start researching. Now. The healer's footsteps retreated, and then there was only silence. Thalia opened her eyes. She was in a bedroom. No, a suite, larger than any space she'd ever occupied. The bed beneath her was canopied in deep blue velvet, and the linens were so white they almost glowed in the late afternoon light streaming through tall windows. A fire crackled in an ornate hearth across the room, filling the air with the scent of cedar and warmth. And sitting in a chair beside her bed, looking like he hadn't moved in hours, was the man who'd called himself Ash. He was watching her with those unnerving amber eyes, his expression utterly unreadable. Someone had cleaned him up since she'd last seen him. The mud was gone from his armor, and his dark hair had been combed back from his face, but he still wore the common soldier's clothing, still looked every inch the warrior. "How do you feel?" he asked quietly. Thalia took stock. The pain in her abdomen had faded to a dull ache. Her head felt clear for the first time in days, and when she pressed her hands to her belly, she felt that precious flutter of movement. Her baby, still there, still fighting. Better, she admitted, her voice hoarse. How long? 3 days. He leaned forward, elbows on knees, close enough that his scent washed over her again. Pine and wood smoke and that darker musk that made her wolf whimper. You've been in and out. The healers weren't sure you'd wake at all. 3 days. She'd lost 3 days. My brother, she said, forcing the words out through a throat gone tight. He'll be wondering if I— Your brother, Ash interrupted, sent word yesterday. He's requested confirmation of your arrival and— His jaw tightened. Inquired about the state of his tribute. Something in his tone made her blood run cold. What did you tell him? Nothing. Yet. He held her gaze, and she saw gold flickering at the edges of his irises. But I have some questions first, starting with why the alpha of the Duskwalker pack would send his own sister as tribute, pregnant, poisoned, and barely alive. Thalia looked away. The mate bond was still there, humming beneath her skin, but she didn't trust it. Didn't trust anything anymore. It's complicated. Uncomplicated. The command hung in the air between them, and Thalia felt her wolf bristle at the alpha authority threaded through those two simple words, even weakened, even lying in a bed that wasn't hers, in a kingdom that could still kill her. Some part of her wanted to bare her teeth at being ordered around, but another part, a treacherous, exhausted part, wanted to tell him everything. Wanted to lay down the burden she'd been carrying alone for so long and let someone else help shoulder it. She kept her gaze fixed on the fire crackling in the hearth, watching the flames dance and twist. My parents died 6 months ago. Officially, it was a fever. A sickness swept through the pack that winter, and father was the first to fall. Mother followed within days. She swallowed hard. Everyone accepted it. These things happen. But I knew better. Ash said nothing, but she felt him shift closer. The warmth of his presence pressed against her awareness like a physical thing, and her wolf, still so newly awakened after days of silence, pressed toward him with desperate longing. Zephyr became alpha. He was the eldest, so it was his right. But she closed her eyes, remembering. He changed. Or maybe he'd always been that way, and I'd just never seen it. He started making alliances with packs our parents had warned us about. Taking money from places that didn't ask questions about how it was spent. And he needed me gone. Why? Because I knew. The words came out barely above a whisper. I knew what he'd done. I was in the forest that day. I'd gone to gather herbs for my mother's garden. I heard them arguing, my father and Zephyr, about money, about Zephyr's debts, about something our father had discovered, something he said he'd kill Zephyr himself before he let it continue. She felt more than heard the growl that rumbled through Ash's chest. And then your father came down with a convenient illness. Yes. Finally, she looked at him, met those amber eyes that seemed to see straight through her defenses. I didn't say anything. I was too scared. Zephyr had always been volatile. I thought if I stayed quiet, stayed small, he'd let me live. But then I found out I was pregnant. Understanding flickered across his harsh features. The child's father? A male from a neighboring pack. It wasn't love, it was loneliness, and one night of bad decisions. She placed her hand on her belly, feeling that flutter of movement that reminded her why she'd fought so hard. He died 2 weeks after. Another accident. Zephyr's specialty. The father knew something too? He knew everything. I'd told him because I was a fool who thought I could trust someone. Bitterness coated her tongue. When Zephyr found out I was pregnant, he saw an opportunity. The Shadow Kingdom had been demanding tribute as part of the border settlement. He could get rid of me and fulfill his obligation at the same time. Two problems solved with one broken body. She expected disgust, expected him to pull back, to reassess, to realize that she wasn't worth the trouble she'd bring to his doorstep. Zephyr was dangerous, and anyone who aligned themselves with her would become a target. Instead, Ash reached out and took her hand. The contact sent lightning racing up her arm. Thalia gasped, her whole body going rigid as heat bloomed from his touch, spreading through her like wildfire. Her wolf howled in recognition, pressing against her skin so hard she could almost feel fur trying to push through. Ash's eyes flashed gold, pure, molten gold, with no trace of amber remaining. His nostrils flared, and she watched his jaw clench hard enough to make the muscle jump beneath his stubble. A growl built in his chest, low and possessive and utterly primal. "You feel that," he said roughly. "Don't you?" "I feel—" She couldn't finish, couldn't articulate the chaos erupting inside her. Her heart was racing, her blood singing, every nerve ending suddenly hyper-aware of him in a way that defied explanation. "Thalia." He said her name like it was sacred, like it was a prayer. "Look at me." She didn't want to. Looking at him made everything worse, made it harder to think, harder to maintain the walls she'd built so carefully around herself. But her wolf had other ideas. Before she could stop herself, her eyes lifted to meet his. The world fell away. Everything. The luxurious room, the crackling fire, the distant sounds of a kingdom going about its business. All of it faded to nothing. There was only him. Only those blazing gold eyes boring into hers, only the warmth of his hand engulfing her smaller one, only the mate bond stretching between them like a golden thread pulled impossibly taut. "Mate," she breathed, the word escaping before she could bite it back. His grip tightened. "Say it again." "I can't. This isn't—" She tried to pull her hand away, but he held fast, not hurting her, never hurting her, but not letting go either. "You don't understand. I'm carrying another male's child. My brother wants me dead. Claiming me would put a target on your back, and You're mine." He leaned closer, close enough that his breath ghosted across her face. "I knew it the moment I touched you at the gate. My wolf nearly tore out of my skin trying to get to you. 3 days I've sat here, watching you sleep, fighting every instinct screaming at me to mark you, to claim you, to make sure no one could ever take you from me. But why?" The question cracked in the middle, and to her horror, she felt tears burning behind her eyes. "I'll bring war to your doorstep. Zephyr won't stop. He can't afford to let me live. Anyone who stands beside me becomes a target. You're everything." He said it with such certainty, such absolute conviction, as if it were simply a fact of the universe, immutable and eternal. "You can't know that," she whispered. "I know what my wolf knows." He released her hand, but only to cup her face in his palms, cradling her like she was something precious. "I know that 3 days ago, a woman crawled to my gates bleeding and broken, and instead of begging for mercy, she was ready to die fighting. I know that she's carrying a child she could have easily let go, but instead, she held on through poison and pain and abandonment. I know that she's looking at me right now like she's waiting for the blow to fall, because that's all she's ever learned to expect." His thumbs brushed away tears she hadn't realized were falling. "I know that I want to kill everyone who ever hurt her," he continued, his voice dropping to something dark and dangerous. "And I know that I will burn the world down before I let anyone touch her again, including her worthless excuse for a brother." Thalia's breath caught. Her wolf was pressing forward so hard it was almost painful, demanding she close the distance between them, demanding she surrender to the bond that was already wrapping itself around her heart. "I don't trust you," she said. The words were honest in a way she rarely allowed herself to be. "I want to, Every part of me is screaming that I should, but I've trusted before, and it nearly got me killed. Then don't trust me. Ash's eyes softened, though the gold remained, shimmering at the edges. Not yet. Let me earn it. Let me show you who I am instead of telling you. And when you're ready, if you're ever ready, we'll talk about what happens next. He released her face and leaned back in his chair, putting space between them. Space she should have been grateful for, but instead felt like loss. You should rest, he said, his voice rougher than before. The healers said you'll need at least another week before you're strong enough to be up and moving. I'll have food sent up. Ash. Sleep, Thalia. A ghost of a smile crossed his harsh features. I'll be here when you wake. She wanted to argue, wanted to demand answers to the 1,000 questions swirling through her mind. But exhaustion was dragging her under, and the mate bond humming between them was oddly soothing now that he'd put distance between them. She slept. True to his word, Ash was there every time she woke. At first, Thalia thought she was imagining it, that the fever lingering in her blood was conjuring hallucinations of a mate who stayed. But as the hours became days, she began to accept that he was real, that every time she opened her eyes, she would find him in that chair beside her bed, sometimes reading, sometimes speaking quietly with healers or servants, sometimes simply watching her with those amber eyes that seemed to see straight to her soul. He never touched her inappropriately, never tried to press his advantage when she was weak and vulnerable. When the nightmares came, and they came often, bloody visions of Zephyr's cold smile and her parents' broken bodies, he simply took her hand and let her rage. The first time, she'd woken screaming, clawing at the blankets as if she could tear her way out of the memory. Ash had been at her side instantly, not restraining her, not shushing her, just there, present, an anchor in the storm. Stop, she'd gasped, not to him, but to the memories, to the blood and the screaming and the images that wouldn't release her. But Ash had gone rigid beside her, his body locking in place as if he'd been turned to stone. For 3 heartbeats he hadn't moved, hadn't breathed. Then whatever held him had released, and he'd shaken his head once, hard, like a wolf throwing off water. What was that? He'd asked, his voice strange. What was what? He'd studied her face in the darkness, something unreadable flickering behind his amber eyes. Then he'd simply said, Nothing. I'm here. Tell me. He killed them, she'd sobbed, the words ripping out of her before she could stop them. He killed them and I did nothing. I was too scared to say anything, too weak to fight back, and now they're dead and he sold me and I'm... You survived. His hand had found hers in the darkness, warm and steady. You're still surviving. That's not good enough. I should have done something. I should have told someone. Maybe if I'd spoken up earlier. Maybe if I'd been braver. Then he would have killed you too, and your child would never have had a chance. She'd stared at him through tear-blurred eyes. You don't know that. I know what men like your brother do to threats. His jaw had tightened, shadows flickering across his face in the firelight. You weren't weak, Thalia. You were smart. You stayed alive long enough to escape. That took more strength than you realize. It was an absolution. He wasn't telling her that what she'd done, or hadn't done, was right. He was simply recognizing the impossible choice she'd faced, the terrible calculus of survival. He was my brother, she'd whispered, something breaking inside her chest. I used to look up to him. When we were children, he'd carry me on his shoulders through the forest. He'd tell me stories about the old wolves, about heroes and battles and love that lasted forever. I thought he'd protect me. He should have. Ash's grip tightened on her hand. That was his duty, to his family, to his pack, to his blood. He failed you in every way a male can fail, and one day he will answer for it. The cold certainty in his voice should have frightened her. Instead, it felt like a promise, like someone finally seeing the injustice that had been done to her and refusing to pretend it was acceptable. "You're angry," she said, surprised. "I'm furious." His eyes flashed gold in the darkness. "Not at you. Never at you. But at everyone who looked the other way while your brother destroyed everything you loved. At the pack that should have protected you and instead became complicit in your abuse. At a world that allows males like Zephyr Duskwalker to hold power while innocents suffer. The world has always been that way. Then the world needs to change." She'd stared at him for a long moment, this strange male who spoke of overturning the natural order as if it were simply a matter of will. "You really believe that?" "I believe that anyone who hurts what's mine will learn the cost of that mistake." He released her hand slowly, as if reluctant to break the contact. "Sleep now. I'll keep the nightmares at bay." He hadn't, of course. The nightmares were her own demons, and no one could fight them for her. But knowing he was there, knowing she wasn't alone in the darkness, it helped. More than she wanted to admit. Days passed. The healers came and went, pronouncing her recovery remarkable and the baby thriving despite everything. Food appeared at regular intervals, rich broths and fresh bread and fruits she hadn't tasted since childhood, and she ate every bite under Ash's watchful eye, her body slowly regaining strength. And through it all, he stayed. He didn't pressure her about the mate bond, didn't ask for more than she was willing to give. When she wanted silence, he gave her silence. When she wanted distraction, he told her stories about the Shadow Kingdom, its history, its people, its strange and beautiful traditions. When she asked questions, he answered honestly, never sugarcoating or evading. She learned that the Shadow Kingdom had been at war for decades before his family took the throne. That the current peace was hard-won and fragile. That the tribute system she'd been thrown into was a relic of that war. A method of keeping former enemies bound to the crown through obligation rather than force. She did not learn what position Ash held in this kingdom. Whenever she asked directly, he deflected with a half-smile that told her nothing. "Focus on healing," he'd say. "Everything else can wait." It was frustrating. He was frustrating. And yet, she was starting to look forward to his presence. Starting to feel the empty space beside her bed like a physical ache when he was called away for whatever duties occupied his time. Starting to trust, despite her best efforts to keep her walls intact. It was the morning of her 6th day of consciousness when that fragile trust was tested. Thalia had been sitting up in bed, attempting to brush the tangles from her hair with a silver brush one of the servants had left, when the door to her chambers burst open. 3 figures swept in. 2 men and 1 woman, all dressed in clothing far finer than anything she'd seen the servants wear. The woman's gown was deep crimson silk, and her dark hair was piled high in an elaborate style studded with rubies. The men flanked her like guards, though their soft hands and unmarked faces suggested they'd never held a sword in their lives. "So this is the tribute," the woman said, her lip curling as she surveyed Thalia with obvious disdain. "I had to see for myself. The servants have been whispering for days about the Duskwalker gift, and I must say, the reality is even more disappointing than the rumors suggested." Thalia's hands tightened on the brush. Her wolf, still weak, but growing stronger, pressed against her skin in warning. "I don't believe we've been introduced." "Lady Marissa of House Thornwood." The woman didn't bow or curtsy, didn't even nod in acknowledgement. "My family has served this kingdom for 5 generations. We don't tend to forget our manners around actual nobility." Her eyes dropped pointedly to Thalia's swollen belly. "Though, I suppose one can't expect much from a tribute whore carrying another male's bastard." The words hit like a physical blow. Thalia had been called many things over the past months, but hearing it here, in what she'd started to think of as a sanctuary. Lady Marissa. Ash's voice cut through the air like a blade, cold and deadly. He'd appeared in the doorway behind the noblewoman, and his expression was carved from stone. I don't recall giving you permission to enter my guest's chambers. Your guest? Lady Marissa laughed, though something flickered in her eyes at his tone. Surely you mean the kingdom's guest. This tribute belongs to the crown, not to some common soldier playing nursemaid. Does she? It wasn't a question. Ash moved into the room with the predatory grace of a wolf stalking prey, and the two men flanking Lady Marissa stumbled backward despite themselves. His eyes never left the noblewoman's face, and even from across the room, Thalia could see the gold bleeding into his irises. I have tolerated your family's pretensions for years, he continued, each word precisely placed like a knife between ribs. Your snide comments, your petty power games, your endless attempts to advance yourselves at the expense of others, but I will not tolerate disrespect toward my mate. The silence that followed was absolute. Lady Marissa's face had gone pale. Your mate? That's impossible. She's just... She is Thalia, formerly of the Duskwalker pack. Ash had stopped directly in front of the noblewoman, forcing her to crane her neck to meet his eyes. And she is mine. The child she carries will be mine. And anyone who speaks ill of either of them will answer to me personally. He was taller than Thalia had realized, broader, standing there in his common soldier's clothing, radiating an authority that made the very air feel heavier. He looked nothing like the man who had patiently fed her broth and held her hand through nightmares. He looked like a king. That is... Lady Marissa was backing toward the door, her companions already fled. I meant no offense, truly, I was simply curious. Then your curiosity has been satisfied. Ash didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Leave, now, and spread the word to anyone who might share your curiosity. Thalia is under my protection. Her child is under my protection. And anyone who threatens either of them threatens the crown itself. Lady Marissa practically ran from the room. Thalia sat frozen in her bed, the brush forgotten in her lap, watching as Ash closed the door behind the fleeing noblewoman. His shoulders were tense, his breathing carefully controlled, and when he turned back to face her, that gold was still burning in his eyes. I apologize, he said, his voice rough with barely contained emotion. I should have posted guards. I didn't expect... The crown, Thalia interrupted. You said she threatened the crown. He went still. You're not a common soldier. It wasn't a question. The pieces were clicking into place. His authority, the way even nobles deferred to him, the elaborate chambers she'd been given. Are you? A long pause. Then, slowly, he shook his head. No. Then who are you? He crossed the room and lowered himself into his usual chair beside her bed. His hands were clasped between his knees, and for the first time since she'd met him, he looked almost uncertain. My name is Tobias Shadowfang, he said quietly, and I am the Alpha King of the Shadow Kingdom. The words hung in the air between them. Thalia stared at him, at this man who had carried her from the gates, who had sat vigil by her sickbed, who had held her hand through nightmares and fed her broth with infinite patience. The Alpha King, the most powerful wolf in 7 kingdoms, and he'd been playing nursemaid to a broken tribute for almost a week. Why? The word came out strangled. Why lie? Why pretend to be someone you're not? Your own soldiers called you Ash. Ashford, my mother's family name. That rueful expression again. The soldiers use it when I'm out of formal dress. They know the game. When I wear common leathers, I'm Ash, and they don't bow or call me Your Majesty. It lets me move through my own kingdom without a parade. And you just happen to be wearing common leathers when I collapsed at your gates. I wear them most days, I'm not much for ceremony. He held her gaze. But the reason I didn't correct you, that was a choice. Why? Because you wouldn't have trusted a king. His amber eyes met hers, and she saw the gold retreating, leaving something softer behind. You were terrified when I found you. Beaten down, betrayed, expecting the worst from everyone. If I'd introduced myself as the Alpha King, you would have seen another threat, another male in power who could hurt you. And as a common soldier? As a common soldier, I was just someone trying to help. A rueful smile crossed his harsh features. Though, I'll admit, the deception became harder to maintain the longer I sat here, watching you fight your way back to strength, learning who you really are, falling. He cut himself off, jaw tightening. Falling? She prompted, her heart pounding. Falling for my mate, he finished roughly, as if there was ever any doubt. From the moment I touched you, Thalia, I was lost. The bond chose you, yes, but so did I. Every moment I spent with you only confirmed what my wolf already knew. Thalia's breath caught. The mate bond was thrumming between them, stronger than it had been since she'd woken, and her wolf was pressing forward with desperate longing. But beneath the instinct, beneath the pull, there was something else, something that felt dangerously like hope. You declared me yours, she said slowly, in front of that woman. You said the child would be yours. I meant every word. But it's not your child. Everyone will know. Everyone will know that the Alpha King has claimed a mate and her child. He leaned forward, his expression fierce. I don't care whose blood runs in that baby's veins. You're mine, and everything that's yours is mine too. That's how this works. That's not how this works. She shook her head, struggling to make sense of a world that had suddenly shifted beneath her feet. Your council won't accept a tribute as Luna. The other kingdoms will see it as weakness. An Alpha King bound to a woman with no allies, no dowry, no political value. They'll use me against you. They don't. This king does. He reached out and took her hand, and the contact sent the same lightning racing through her that it always did. Let me be clear, Thalia, because I suspect clarity is something you haven't had much of lately. I don't care about your past. I don't care about your brother or your former pack, or the male who fathered your child. I care about you, about your future, about building something together that neither of us could manage alone. You're insane, she whispered, but there was no heat in the words, only wonder. Probably. His thumb stroked across her knuckles. But I'm also yours. Whatever you're willing to accept, whatever pace you need to move at, I'm not going anywhere. The mate bond isn't a prison, and I won't treat it like one. But I won't pretend it doesn't exist either. He released her hand and stood, moving toward the door. I'll send a healer to check on you, and this time there will be guards. No one enters without your permission. Tobias. He stopped, his hand on the door handle, and looked back at her. Thalia struggled to find the right words. Everything she wanted to say felt too big, too fragile, too easily broken. But he'd given her honesty, and she owed him the same. I'm not ready to accept the bond, she said finally. I don't know if I'll ever be ready. Too much has happened, and I'm still trying to figure out who I am without everything that was taken from me. His expression flickered with something that might have been disappointment, but he nodded. I understand. But she took a breath. I'm willing to try, to learn who you are, not just what my wolf says you are, to see if we, could be something real. The smile that broke across his face transformed him, made him look younger somehow, almost boyish. That's all I ask, he said softly, for now. He left, and Thalia was alone with the warmth of his presence still lingering in the air, her hand still tingling where he'd touched her, and her wolf howling with something that felt terrifyingly like joy, The joy lasted exactly 3 days. 3 days of healers coming and going, their hands gentle, their remedies slowly knitting her body back together. 3 days of meals that arrived hot and plentiful, of guards who nodded respectfully when she passed them in the hallway outside her chambers. 3 days of Tobias visiting each evening, sitting in the chair beside her bed, asking questions and actually listening to her answers. He wanted to know everything: her favorite foods, her childhood memories, the dreams she'd had before her world collapsed. Thalia found herself telling him things she'd never told anyone, about the way her mother used to braid her hair while humming old pack songs, about the clearing in the forest where she'd first learned to shift, about the night she'd realized her brother had changed into someone she didn't recognize. She didn't tell him about the father of her child. Not yet. Some wounds were too fresh, too complicated, and Tobias seemed to sense that, never pushing when she fell silent. On the fourth day, her peace shattered. Thalia was walking in the palace gardens, accompanied by a healer named Margot, who had taken a particular interest in her case. The morning sun filtered through the autumn leaves, casting golden light across the stone pathways, and for the first time since her arrival, Thalia felt something like contentment settling into her bones. Then she heard the voice. "Sister." The word hit her like a physical blow, stopping her mid-step. Her wolf, which had been drowsing contentedly in the warmth of the mate bond, suddenly surged forward with a snarl of pure hatred. Thalia turned slowly, already knowing what she would see. Zephyr Duskwalker stood at the garden's entrance, flanked by 2 Shadow Kingdom guards who looked distinctly uncomfortable with their charge. He was dressed in diplomatic finery, deep green velvet that matched his eyes, silver embroidery catching the light, and his face wore the same charming smile that had fooled everyone for years. Everyone except Thalia, who knew exactly what lurked beneath that handsome mask. "What are you doing here?" Her voice came out steadier than she expected, but her hands were trembling at her sides. "I'm an ambassador now." Zephyr spread his arms in a gesture of innocent surprise. "Didn't anyone tell you? The Duskwalker pack wishes to establish formal relations with the Shadow Kingdom. Given the recent unpleasantness with our tribute arrangement, the council thought it best to send someone who could speak to the matter personally." Unpleasantness? He called selling her into near death an unpleasantness. "You need to leave." Thalia's wolf was pressing against her skin, desperate to shift, to tear out the throat of the male who had destroyed everything she loved. But she was still weak, still recovering, and Zephyr had always been the stronger fighter. "Now." "I'm afraid I can't do that, little sister." He took a step closer, and the guards moved with him, clearly uncertain whether to intervene. "I have diplomatic immunity, you see. The Alpha King himself approved my credentials this morning." Ice flooded Thalia's veins. Tobias had approved, but he didn't know. He couldn't know what Zephyr had done, what he was capable of. She hadn't told him everything, hadn't explained the full depth of her brother's betrayal. She should have. She should have warned him. "You look well." Zephyr's eyes dropped to her stomach, where the slight swell of her pregnancy was just beginning to show through her loose dress. "Better than expected, honestly. The healers here must be quite skilled." "Skilled enough to recognize wolfsbane poisoning?" Thalia watched his face carefully and saw the flicker of surprise he couldn't quite hide. "Yes, they found it. Every trace you slipped into my food and water before you shipped me off like damaged goods." "I don't know what you're talking about." "You're a terrible liar. You always have been." She forced herself to stand straighter to meet his green eyes with her own. "I know what you did to Mother and Father, Zephyr. I know everything." Something shifted in his expression. The charming mask slipped, just for a moment, and she saw the cold calculation underneath. The predator she'd always sensed but never wanted to acknowledge. "Be careful, sister." His voice dropped low enough that the guards couldn't hear. "You're in a precarious position. Damaged tribute, carrying another male's bastard, clinging to a mate bond that the Alpha King never asked for. How long do you think his protection will last once the novelty wears off? Longer than your diplomatic immunity will last once I tell him the truth. Zephyr smiled, and it was the most terrifying thing she'd ever seen. Tell him what exactly? That your brother sold you as tribute to cover debts? That's not a crime. It's pack politics. That I poisoned your food? Prove it. That I killed our parents? He laughed softly. Everyone knows they died of the fever, Thalia. Everyone mourned at the funeral. You'll sound like a madwoman, grasping at accusations because you're bitter about your circumstances. He was right. That was the worst part. Everything he'd done carefully, covering his tracks with the same meticulous precision he brought to everything. She had no proof, nothing but her own certainty and the memories that haunted her dreams. The Alpha King trusts you? She couldn't keep the disbelief from her voice. The Alpha King trusts the treaty I'm here to negotiate. Trade routes, border agreements, military cooperation. All things the Shadow Kingdom needs. Zephyr's smile widened. I'm very good at making myself useful, sister. You should try it sometime. Margot stepped forward, her hand closing around Thalia's elbow. My lady, we should return to your chambers. The morning air isn't good for your condition. Thalia let herself be led away, but she felt Zephyr's eyes on her back the entire time, a weight as heavy as a blade pressed between her shoulder blades. He wasn't here for diplomacy. She knew that with bone-deep certainty. He was here to finish what he'd started. The question was how to stop him before he succeeded. The answer came to her that evening, wrapped in the scent of pine and rain. Tobias arrived at her chambers just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. He looked tired. There were shadows beneath his golden eyes that hadn't been there that morning, but his face lit up when he saw her, the mate bond humming with warmth between them. I heard you had a visitor today. He settled into his usual chair, and Thalia noticed the careful way he moved, as if restraining himself from reaching for her. Your brother. You approved his credentials. It came out sharper than she intended, and she saw him wince. I did. Before I knew who he was to you. He leaned forward, his elbows braced on his knees. I should have consulted you first. I'm sorry. The apology caught her off guard. She'd been preparing for a fight, for defensive explanations, for the same dismissive attitude she'd encountered from every authority figure in her life. Instead, here was the most powerful wolf in the realm, simply admitting he'd made a mistake. You didn't know, she said finally, her anger deflating. I should have told you about him sooner. Tell me now. His voice was gentle, but there was steel beneath it. Tell me everything, Thalia. Whatever he's done, whatever you're afraid of. I can't protect you from threats I don't understand. So she told him. About her parents' deaths, how her father had weakened slowly over weeks. The tea Zephyr brought him every evening, and then her mother falling ill just days after finding empty vials hidden in Zephyr's chambers. About the way Zephyr's grief at the funeral had been polished and perfect, rehearsed in a way genuine sorrow never is. About the small inconsistencies she'd noticed, her father's beta vanishing the same week, the debts that somehow cleared themselves within a month of the burial, the gradual changes in her brother over the following months. She told him about the debts, the gambling, the bad investments, the deals with packs that existed on the margins of wolf society. The growing desperation in Zephyr's eyes as the pack's resources dwindled and his creditors came calling. She told him about the day she'd discovered she was pregnant, and the cold fury that had replaced any pretense of brotherly affection in Zephyr's face, about the way her food had started to taste wrong, the nausea that was too severe, the bleeding that shouldn't have happened, about the morning she'd woken to find guards at her door and her brother's decree that she was to be given as tribute to settle a border dispute. He wanted me dead, she finished, her voice raw from talking. The pregnancy was an excuse, but the truth is, I knew too much. I saw too clearly what he'd become. As long as I was alive, I was a threat to everything he'd built. Tobias was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely recognizable, low, rough, vibrating with barely controlled rage. "I'll kill him." "You can't." Thalia reached out and took his hand, feeling the tension thrumming through his muscles. "He has diplomatic immunity. He's negotiating a treaty that your kingdom needs. And he's right. I have no proof of anything. It would look like you were executing an ambassador based on your mate's accusations. I don't care how it looks. You should." She squeezed his hand, forcing him to meet her eyes. "You're the Alpha King. You can't rule with impulse and emotion, no matter how justified. I learned that lesson watching my brother destroy everything my parents built." Something shifted in his expression. The rage was still there, burning beneath the surface, but she could see him wrestling it back under control. When he spoke again, his voice was steadier. "Then we gather proof. We watch him, document everything, catch him in the act of whatever he's planning." His jaw tightened. "Because he is planning something, isn't he?" "Yes." Thalia shivered, remembering the cold calculation in her brother's eyes. He didn't come here for trade routes. He came here to finish what he started. "Then we'll be ready for him." Tobias lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, the gesture achingly gentle. "I won't let him hurt you, Thalia. Not while I'm breathing." The mate bond surged between them, and for a moment, she almost believed him. Almost trusted that this time, this place, this male would be different from everything she'd known before. Then she remembered the way her parents had looked at each other, the way they'd promised to protect each other always. They'd meant it too. And they'd both ended up dead. The next week passed in a blur of careful watching and growing tension. Zephyr moved through the palace like a serpent through tall grass, smooth, charming, utterly at ease among the Shadow Kingdom's nobility. He attended dinners and danced at balls, negotiated trade agreements, and complimented the courtiers on their exquisite taste. Everyone seemed to find him delightful. Everyone except Thalia, who saw the glances he stole toward the healer's wing. The questions he asked about the palace's security rotations, the way his smile never quite reached his cold green eyes. She started keeping a journal, documenting everything she noticed. The servants he spent too much time talking to. The packages that arrived for him by private courier. The fact that he always seemed to know exactly where she was, even when she changed her routine. Tobias doubled the guards on her chambers, but he couldn't follow her everywhere without arousing suspicion. So Thalia learned to watch her own back, to sleep with one ear listening for footsteps, to test everything she ate and drank for the bitter taste of wolfsbane. It was exhausting. It was terrifying. And somehow, impossibly, it brought her closer to Tobias. He started visiting earlier in the evenings, staying later into the night. They talked about everything: politics and poetry, childhood memories and hopes for the future. He made her laugh with stories about his early reign, the disasters and near misses that had shaped him into the king he'd become. She found herself sharing things she'd never told anyone, secrets and dreams she'd buried so deep she'd almost forgotten they existed. One night, nearly 2 weeks after Zephyr's arrival, Thalia woke from a nightmare to find Tobias sitting in the darkness by her bed. She could see the gleam of his golden eyes, feel the warmth of the mate bond reaching for her like a physical touch. "You were crying in your sleep," he said softly. "I heard you through the wall." She should have been embarrassed, should have told him to leave, to respect her privacy, to stop hovering like a protective shadow. Instead, she reached out and took his hand. "Stay," she whispered. "Please." He didn't ask questions, didn't try to talk about what she'd dreamed or what had frightened her so badly. He simply moved to sit beside her on the bed, his back against the headboard, and let her curl into his warmth with her head on his shoulder. His arm came around her, holding her close but not too tight. She could feel his heartbeat, steady and strong, and the mate bond hummed with contentment as it settled into the contact. "Is this all right?" His voice was rough, careful. "Yes." She pressed her face into the junction of his neck and shoulder, breathing in the scent of him, pine and rain and something indefinably male. Her wolf settled with a sigh of pure relief. This is exactly right. They stayed like that until morning, not speaking, not moving, just existing together in the quiet darkness. When dawn light began to filter through the curtains, Tobias pressed a kiss to her hair and slipped away before the servants arrived. But the imprint of his warmth stayed with her all day, and when Zephyr's cold eyes found her across the breakfast hall, Thalia met his gaze with something she hadn't felt in months: defiance. The attack came 3 days later. Thalia was in the healer's wing, undergoing her regular checkup, when the first scream echoed through the palace corridors. She was on her feet before the sound faded, her wolf surging forward with instinctive alarm. "Stay here." Margot was already moving toward the door, her expression grim. "The king's guards will—" The door burst open and two figures stumbled through. Palace servants, their faces twisted with terror. Behind them came the smell of smoke and something darker. Something that made Thalia's wolf snarl with recognition. Blood. Death. Rogues. "The ambassador's wing is under attack," one of the servants gasped. "They came through the walls somehow, dozens of them." But Thalia wasn't listening anymore. Her mind was racing, putting together pieces she should have seen before. Zephyr's questions about security rotations, the packages from private couriers, the way he always knew exactly where everyone was. This wasn't a random attack. This was a coordinated assault, planned from the inside, and she would bet everything she had that her brother wasn't among the victims. "Where's the king?" she demanded, grabbing the nearest servant's arm. "Where's Tobias?" "He went to the ambassador's wing when the attack started. He's fighting with his guards, but there are so many of them, and—" Thalia didn't wait to hear the rest. She was already running, her slippers skidding on the stone floors, her wolf lending her strength she shouldn't have possessed. The mate bond was screaming in her chest, a constant pull toward him, toward danger, toward the male she hadn't yet claimed but couldn't bear to lose. The corridor leading to the ambassador's wing was chaos. Bodies littered the ground, some wearing palace livery, others the rough clothing of wolves who had long since abandoned pack laws. The smell of blood was overwhelming, thick and coppery, coating the back of her throat. She found Tobias in the great hall that connected the wing to the rest of the palace. He was in his half-shifted form, claws extended, golden eyes blazing as he tore through attackers with terrifying efficiency. Bodies fell around him like wheat before a scythe, and his guards formed a defensive ring at his back. But there were too many rogues, too many teeth and claws pressing in from every direction. And there, standing in the shadows of a side corridor, watching the carnage with a satisfied smile, was Zephyr. Their eyes met across the chaos, and Thalia saw the truth in her brother's face. The cold triumph, the absolute certainty that his plan was succeeding. He thought he'd won. He thought she was still the weak, broken sister he'd sent away to die. He was wrong. Thalia felt something crack open inside her. Something that had been dormant since the day her parents died. Power flooded through her veins, raw and primal, channeled through the mate bond that blazed like a beacon in her chest. She didn't fully understand what she was doing, but she remembered the nightmare, the way Ash had frozen when she'd gasped that single word in the dark. The power that had brushed against her then was a candle flame. This was a wildfire. And when she opened her mouth, the word that emerged wasn't a scream. It was a command. "Stop." The power rolled through the hall like a wave, and every wolf in the room, every single one, froze. The rogues, the guards, even Tobias, his claws still raised, his golden eyes finding hers with stunned recognition. And Zephyr, his smile finally faltering as he realized what his little sister had become. You. Thalia's voice was steady, ringing with authority she'd never known she possessed. You did this. All of it. Thalia? Zephyr started, but she cut him off with another pulse of power. Don't lie to me. She stepped forward, and the rogues parted around her like water around a stone. Don't you dare lie to me again. She was almost close enough to touch him now, and she could see the fear finally breaking through his mask. Good. Let him be afraid. Let him feel what she'd felt for months, waking up every day wondering if it would be her last. This ends now, she said softly. All of it. Every scheme, every manipulation, every life you've destroyed to feed your ambition. It ends tonight. Zephyr's hand moved toward his belt, toward the blade she knew would be poisoned. But before he could draw it, before he could make one more desperate play for survival, the mate bond flared with savage triumph. And Tobias was there, his claws closing around her brother's throat, his voice a growl that promised death. You heard my mate, the Alpha King snarled. It ends now. Tobias's claws pressed deeper into Zephyr's throat, drawing thin lines of blood that trickled down his pale skin. The rogues remained frozen around them, held in place by the power Thalia had somehow unleashed, their eyes wild with confusion and fear. She could feel them straining against her command, could sense the moment when her control would shatter and chaos would erupt again. But she wasn't finished yet. Wait, she said, and Tobias's golden eyes found hers, burning with barely restrained violence. His wolf was so close to the surface that his features had sharpened, his jaw elongating slightly, his canines extended and gleaming. Every line of his body screamed for blood, for vengeance, for the death of the male who had tried to destroy his mate. He doesn't deserve a quick death, Thalia continued, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. He deserves the truth first. He deserves to have everyone know exactly what he is. Zephyr's eyes darted around the hall, calculating even now, searching for escape routes that didn't exist. Thalia, please. You don't understand. I did what I had to do. Our pack was dying. Father was weak, and Mother refused to see reason. I saved us. By killing them. The words tore from her throat like broken glass. By poisoning your own parents and blaming the fever that swept through the territory? A murmur rippled through the assembled wolves, guards and rogues alike, voices straining through clenched teeth and locked jaws. Her command had frozen their bodies, but not their tongues. They could hear. They could witness. That's a lie, Zephyr snarled. But his voice cracked on the denial. You can't prove... I don't need to prove anything. Thalia stepped closer, and she felt the power inside her pulse with each heartbeat. I can make you tell them yourself. She didn't know where the certainty came from, didn't understand the gift that had awakened inside her. But the mate bond sang with recognition, with rightness, and when she reached out with her will, she felt something ancient and terrible respond. Confess, she commanded, and the word resonated with power that made the very stones beneath their feet vibrate. Zephyr's mouth opened against his will, his eyes going wide with horror as the truth spilled from his lips like poison being drawn from a wound. I killed them. The words were wrenched from him, ugly and raw. Father first, wolfsbane in his evening tea, just enough to weaken him over weeks. Then Mother, when she started asking questions. She found the empty vials in my chambers, and I couldn't let her tell anyone. Tears streamed down his face, but Thalia felt nothing. No sympathy, no mercy, no sisterly love for the monster wearing her brother's skin. And Thalia? Tobias's voice was death itself, cold and final. Tell them what you did to your own sister. Zephyr sobbed, his body convulsing against the compulsion. I sold her to pay my debts. I owed gold to the Eastern kingdoms, gambling debts, bribes to secure alliances. When the Shadow Kingdom demanded tribute, I saw my chance. I gave them my pregnant sister, hoping she'd die on the journey. When she didn't die fast enough, I dosed her tea with wolfsbane before the cart left, enough to trigger a miscarriage on the road. I wanted her to bleed out before she ever reached the gates. The hall erupted in shocked whispers, in growls of outrage. Even the rogues, mercenaries paid to fight and kill, looked disgusted. You were always the weak one, Zephyr spat, his mask finally crumbling entirely. Should have died with mother and father. Should have been grateful I gave you any purpose at all. But you just kept surviving, kept ruining everything. He lunged. Thalia saw the movement in slow motion, her brother's hand finally reaching the poisoned blade at his belt, his arm arcing toward her swollen belly, his face twisted with the hatred that had always lurked beneath his charming smile. But Tobias was faster. The Alpha King's claws caught Zephyr's wrist, shattering bone with a sickening crack. The blade clattered to the stone floor, and Tobias's other hand closed around her brother's throat once more, lifting him off his feet like he weighed nothing at all. For your parents, Tobias said, his voice carrying through the suddenly silent hall. For your pack, who you sold into corruption and ruin. His claws tightened, and Zephyr's face began to turn purple. For your sister, Tobias continued, golden eyes blazing with righteous fury. Who you tried to murder along with her unborn child. Thalia watched her brother die, watched the light fade from eyes that had once looked at her with something she'd mistaken for love. Watched his body go limp, then crumple to the floor when Tobias finally released him. She felt nothing. No, that wasn't true. She felt relief, vast and overwhelming, spreading through her like warmth returning to frozen limbs. She felt the weight of months of fear finally lifting from her shoulders. She felt the mate bond singing with triumph and protectiveness, and something deeper, something that made her wolf howl with joy. She felt free. The rogues were stirring now, her hold on them finally weakening. But before they could attack, before chaos could erupt again, Tobias's voice rang through the hall with alpha authority that made every wolf in the room bow their heads. These wolves were deceived and manipulated, he said, gesturing to the mercenaries. They were told they would be paid in gold and territory. They were lied to by a murderer and traitor. His golden eyes swept over the frozen rogues, assessing, judging. Those who surrender now and pledge loyalty to the Shadow Kingdom will be given the chance to prove their worth. Those who don't. He didn't need to finish the threat. One by one, the rogues dropped to their knees, baring their throats in submission. Within moments, the great hall had transformed from a battlefield to a throne room, with the Alpha King standing victorious among his enemies, and Thalia standing at his side. Tobias turned to her, and the violence drained from his features, replaced by something soft and wondering. "You're hurt," he said, reaching toward her with hands that had just killed for her. "You're bleeding." She looked down, surprised to find that he was right. A shallow cut on her arm, probably from a rogue's claw during the chaos. She hadn't even felt it. "I'm fine," she said, but Tobias was already pulling her close, his arms wrapping around her with desperate gentleness. "You were magnificent," he breathed into her hair. "That power. I've never seen anything like it. You stopped them all with a single word. I don't know how I did it." Her voice was muffled against his chest, and she realized she was shaking. The aftermath of adrenaline, of terror, of the grief she'd been holding at bay for months. "I didn't even know I could." "I've heard of wolves who can do what you just did," Tobias said, pulling back to cup her face in his hands. His own were still trembling. "It's rare, ancient. We'll figure out the rest later, when you're ready, when this isn't so raw. My parents." The words caught in her throat. He killed them, Tobias. He killed them, and I didn't know. I mourned beside him at their funeral, and I didn't know. How could you have known? His thumb traced her cheekbone, wiping away tears she hadn't realized she was crying. He fooled everyone, but he's gone now. He can't hurt you anymore. Thalia looked at her brother's body, lying crumpled on the stone floor like discarded trash. She waited for the pain to hit, for the sisterly love she'd once felt to resurge and drown her in grief. It didn't come. I want to leave this place, she whispered. I want to forget this ever happened. Then we leave. Tobias pressed a kiss to her forehead, then turned to his guards. Secure the rogues. Have the healers tend to the wounded. And remove that from my sight. He gestured to Zephyr's body without looking at it. Burn it with the other traitors. No ceremony, no burial, no honor. It was exactly what he deserved. Tobias led her through corridors still smoky from the attack, past servants who bowed low and guards who saluted with fists over hearts. The palace was in chaos, but somehow, with Tobias's hand warm in hers, Thalia felt safer than she had in months. They reached his chambers. Their chambers? She realized, because at some point she'd stopped thinking of the guest room as her space. And Tobias closed the door behind them, shutting out the world and all its horrors. Thalia. His voice was rough, strained with emotion he was clearly struggling to control. I need you to know. I know. She turned to face him, and the mate bond blazed between them, undeniable and eternal. I feel it too. I've been trying to give you time. He was pacing now, running his hands through his dark hair, his golden eyes wild. Trying to let you heal, to choose me on your own terms. But tonight, when I thought I might lose you, when I saw him reach for that blade, he stopped, his chest heaving, and Thalia saw the wolf in his eyes, saw the primal need that he'd been holding back for weeks. I can't lose you, he said, the words barely more than a growl. I can't. You're mine, Thalia. And if you're not ready to hear that, if you need more time, I'll give it to you. I'll give you whatever you need. But I need you to know that I am yours. Completely, irrevocably yours. The mate bond sang. Thalia crossed the distance between them in 3 steps, her hands fisting in his shirt, pulling him down to her. When their lips met, it was like coming home, like finding the place she'd been searching for her entire life without knowing it existed. Tobias groaned against her mouth, his arms wrapping around her, lifting her until her feet left the ground. He carried her to the bed, laying her down with reverent gentleness that made her heart ache. Are you sure? He asked, his voice strained with the effort of holding back. After everything tonight, if you need to rest, I need you. She pulled him down to her, claiming his mouth again. I need to feel alive. I need to know this is real. It's real. He kissed her jaw, her throat, the sensitive spot behind her ear that made her gasp. I'm real, and I'm never letting you go. The bond was screaming now, demanding completion, demanding the mark that would tie them together forever. Thalia had never wanted anything so much in her life. Mark me, she whispered, tilting her head to bare her throat. Please, Tobias, make me yours. He stilled above her, his golden eyes blazing with intensity that took her breath away. You understand what you're asking? Once the bond is complete, it can never be broken. You'll feel my emotions, my thoughts, my wolf. You'll be Luna of the Shadow Kingdom, my queen, my equal in all things. I understand. She reached up to touch his face, tracing the sharp line of his jaw. I want it. I want you. I want everything. Tobias's control shattered. He kissed her deeply, desperately, his hands trembling as they traced the curves of her body. Thalia arched into his touch, her wolf rising to meet his, 2 halves of a whole finally coming together. Not yet. He growled against her skin. I want to worship you first. I want to make you feel cherished, treasured, loved, beyond reason. And he did. By the time his mouth found the junction of her neck and shoulder, Thalia was burning with need, her entire body aching for completion. She felt his hesitation, his wolf straining against the leash, waiting for her final permission. Yes, she breathed. Yes, Tobias. Now. His fangs pierced her skin, and the world exploded into sensation, pain, sharp and bright, blooming from the mark site. But beneath it, around it, through it, pleasure unlike anything she'd ever known. The mate bond burst open like a dam breaking, and suddenly she could feel everything. His love, vast and overwhelming, crashing over her in waves. His fear, still lingering from the moment he'd thought he might lose her. His joy, incandescent and all-consuming, at finally claiming what was his. She felt his wolf, prowling at the edges of his consciousness, purring with satisfaction at their completed bond. She felt his heart, beating in perfect synchrony with her own. She felt his soul, ancient and powerful, wrapping around hers like armor. Mine. He growled against her throat, his tongue soothing the mark that would remain forever. My mate. My Luna. My everything. But Thalia wasn't finished. She pushed at his shoulders, and Tobias pulled back, confusion flickering in his golden eyes. Then understanding dawned as she rose up, pressing him back against the pillows, reversing their positions. My turn, she said, and watched his eyes go wide with shock and desperate hope. Alpha males didn't bare their throats. Alpha kings didn't submit to anyone. But Tobias tipped his head back without hesitation, exposing the vulnerable column of his neck to her hungry gaze. Yours, he breathed. I'm yours, Thalia. Mark me. Claim me. Make me yours. Her wolf surged forward, lending her strength and instinct. She kissed his throat first, feeling his pulse pound against her lips, tasting the salt of his skin. Then she found the spot that called to her, the junction of his neck and shoulder, mirror to her own mark, and bit down. His blood was hot on her tongue, tasting of power and pine and home. She felt the bond expand again, flowing in both directions now, a perfect circle of connection that would never be broken. His pleasure crashed through her, mingling with her own until she couldn't tell where she ended and he began. Thalia. Her name was a prayer on his lips, a worship, a vow. I'm yours. Do you understand? Yours. She released him slowly, licking the wound closed, watching with satisfaction as the mark took shape on his skin. He was hers now, the Alpha King of the Shadow Kingdom. The most powerful wolf in the realm belonged to her and her alone. Yours, she whispered, settling against his chest. I'm yours, and you're mine. Forever, he agreed, his arms wrapping around her, pulling her close. For as long as the stars burn and the moon rises. Forever, my love. The bond settled into place between them, warm and steady and eternal. Thalia could feel Tobias's heartbeat as if it were her own, could sense his wolf curled contentedly around hers in some space that existed beyond the physical world. She was no longer alone, would never be alone again. The weeks that followed were a blur of healing and transformation. The rogues who had surrendered were integrated into the Shadow Kingdom's forces after extensive vetting and retraining. The poison supplies were destroyed, replaced with fresh medicines from kingdoms across the realm. And Thalia's pregnancy progressed beautifully under the care of healers who treated her like the queen she had become. 7 months along now, her belly round and heavy, the baby growing stronger every day. The coronation was held on a crisp autumn morning, 2 months after the attack, with representatives from a dozen kingdoms gathered to witness the impossible. An Alpha King placing a crown on his mate's head, elevating a tribute to Luna of the Shadow Kingdom. Thalia stood before the assembled nobles in a gown of deepest midnight blue, silver embroidery tracing patterns of moons and stars across the fabric. Her mate mark was visible above the neckline, a badge of honor rather than a brand of ownership. "I present to you Luna Thalia Shadowfang," Tobias announced, his voice carrying across the great hall. "My mate, my equal, my queen. Let all who would challenge her authority know that they challenge me as well." The hall did not erupt in cheers, not immediately. There was a beat of silence, heavy, loaded, every noble in the room calculating what this meant for their alliances, their ambitions, their carefully maintained hierarchies. A tribute as Luna, the impossible made real. Thalia felt the silence like a weight on her chest, but she didn't flinch. She'd faced worse than disapproval. She stepped forward, and her voice carried across the hall with a steadiness that surprised even her. "I was sold to this kingdom as tribute," she said, "thrown away by my own blood and left to die at your gates. I know what many of you think, that I don't belong here, that a tribute has no place beside a king." She paused, letting the words settle. "You're right. No one belongs as tribute. The system that brought me here is a relic of a crueler age, and as my first act as Luna, I am asking the King's Council to abolish it. No more lives bartered to settle debts. No more wolves treated as currency." The silence shifted. She felt it. The surprise, the grudging respect, the few who were already angry. "Any pack currently bound by tribute obligations will be offered fair trade agreements instead," Thalia continued, "including the Duskwalker pack, which will be absorbed under just rule with new leadership appointed by this council." She looked at Tobias, and through the bond felt his fierce pride. He hadn't known she was going to do this. She hadn't told him. The first pair of hands to clap belonged to Margot, standing near the back of the hall, her healer's robes a plain contrast to the silk and velvet surrounding her. Then another. Then another. And then the hall erupted. And the sound was sweeter for having been earned rather than given. That night, curled together in their chambers, Tobias traced lazy patterns on her stomach. "What do you want to call her?" he asked. Thalia considered. She'd thought about this for months, turning names over in her mind like polished stones. "Aurora," she finally said, "for the dawn, for new beginnings." Tobias smiled, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Aurora Shadowfang. I like it. Not just Shadowfang." Thalia turned to meet his eyes. "Aurora Shadowfang Ashford. I won't erase my parents' memory, the good parts of who I was before. She'll carry both names, both legacies." "Both legacies," Tobias agreed. "The strength of the Shadow Kingdom and the courage of a survivor. Our daughter will be unstoppable." Aurora was born on the winter solstice, the longest night of the year, giving way to the first light of a new dawn. Tobias held Thalia's hand through every contraction, never once leaving her side. And when their daughter took her first breath, both parents wept with joy. "She's perfect," Tobias breathed, cradling the tiny bundle in arms that had torn through armies. "Absolutely perfect." "Tobias," Thalia's voice caught, her eyes. He looked down, and she watched the wonder break across his face. Gold. Not the dark brown they'd expected, not the coloring of the male who had fathered her. Aurora's eyes were molten gold, the exact shade of Tobias's wolf. "That's impossible," the healer murmured from the doorway. "Biologically, the mate bond can't." "The bond claimed her," Tobias said quietly, his voice rough with awe. "The way it claimed me, the way it claimed us." He pressed his lips to Aurora's forehead, and through the bond, Thalia felt the moment he stopped thinking of Aurora as a child he'd chosen to love and started knowing her as his own. "Our daughter." He leaned down to kiss Thalia softly. "Thank you. Thank you for surviving, for fighting, for choosing me. Thank you for giving me everything I never knew I needed." Through the mate bond, Thalia felt his love, vast and endless. A ocean she could drown in forever. She let herself sink into it, let herself finally believe that this was real, this was permanent, this was home. "I love you," she whispered, the words still new enough to feel precious. "I love you too." Tobias settled beside her on the bed, Aurora cradled between them, and said nothing else. He didn't need to. The bond said it all. Outside the window, the sun rose over the Shadow Kingdom, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. Somewhere below, servants were already preparing for the celebrations that would welcome the newest member of the royal family. But in this moment, none of that mattered. All that mattered was the warmth of her mate beside her, the weight of her daughter in her arms, and the knowledge that she would never be alone again. The tribute had become a queen, the broken had become whole, and they would live happily, loved and loving for all the days to come.